This is the Losses Become Gains podcast, the podcast that talks about and normalizes the complexities of grief, life after loss, and all this entails. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. I'm a grief and transformational life coach, and I'm here to serve you guidance, tangible tools, and inspiration to help you cultivate a more meaningful, intentional, and beautiful life. A life where you'll discover gains from your losses and so much more. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. Hi guys, before we dive in, I wanted to let you know that this is part one of this highly educational and impactful episode with my special guest, Karla Helbert, who I will introduce in just a moment. But truly, this conversation was so jam-packed with greatness that I had to split it into two because I wanted it to be as digestible for you as possible. So be sure to look out for part two coming next week. Hello there, my friend. Welcome back to the Losses Become Gains podcast. I am your host, Tara Accardo. Today, I have Karla Helbert with me. Karla has a breadth of knowledge when it comes to understanding and coping with loss, not only from her personal experience, but her very impressive resume, including being a licensed professional counselor, internationally certified yoga therapist, a compassionate bereavement care provider, certified yoga instructor, meditation teacher, certified hypnotherapist, Reiki practitioner, and an award-winning author. I know, amazing, right? But her life completely changed, like many of ours do, when her firstborn child died of a brain tumor in 2006. Her therapy practice has a focus on loss, grief, and bereavement, and in particular, she works with those affected by trauma and very traumatic death. And one of the main things that she focuses on with clients is having compassion for the self in grief, which is so important, and allowing feelings rather than judging your experience with them. And really learning to cultivate a strong back, as she calls it, in your grief, and being able to grow into your personal truth, independent of what others say that you should do. And there are a lot of shoulds out there. And this is a major skill that helps us as we grow and learn through the process of living with grief. And we talk about that a lot in both part one and part two of this episode. And this mindset, this approach that she has resonated with me so deeply, as it's very aligned with my own philosophy on grief as well. So I cannot wait to share this episode with you today. I am chomping at the bit to share this with you. I certainly learned a lot, and you are going to leave with some things to think about, I assure you. So again, remember, part two of this conversation is coming next week, but for now, enjoy part one, kick back, relax. And with that being said, let's dig into it. Karla, welcome to the Losses Become Gains podcast. I'm very happy to have you on today, but also just the more that I kind of got to know you, checked you out online a little bit, looked at all of your background and all of the things, I am so excited to talk to you today and get into it. And I just know that your own life experiences and all of the expertise that you have are really going to help the listeners here today. So I am just so grateful for your time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really looking forward to it. I hope that, somehow whatever comes out of our conversation can be helpful for our listeners for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about who you are. We'll get into the grief and the loss and all the things, but I always love to ask people, just who are you outside of all of that and all that good stuff.
I'll tell you, it's kind of hard to separate who I am outside of all of that, actually, especially at this point in my life. I mean, kind of that's part of one of the things that I've said a lot of times is after you have this kind of traumatic loss, one of the big tasks that I believe in, well, one is how to figure out how to have a relationship with somebody who's not here. That's one. And then the other thing is figuring out who you are, because you're changed and you're never the same.
Yep.
And, so over time, I mean, I guess some parts of me kind of like wove back in, but it's really weird because it is all wrapped up in who I am. So I'm a lot of things, I guess. I'm a psychotherapist, I'm a yoga therapist, I'm a grief expert, I'm a perpetual mourner, but that didn't happen until my big grief. a teacher, meditation teacher, and I've always been like really interested in multiple different aspects and ways of incorporating spirit into my life. That was true before my major loss. And then for a while, I mean, maybe you experienced this, it's this whole like everything that you leaned on before is all gone. And so I had this period of just like, I had nothing. And then eventually things began coming back together in a different way. But that's a big part of who I am. Love to be outside, love to be in nature. I love the ocean. I love the mountains, which I'm from the Appalachian Mountains. And so that's home. But also I spent a lot of time on the East Coast and on at the beach. Luckily in Virginia, which is where I live, they're not too far away from each other. So
Yeah.
have mountains and the ocean pretty quick,
Yeah.
close distance to each other. I'm a plant-based person. I don't eat animals. I love my animal friends. And that's been also sort of part of my grief journey as well. But even before that, it's always been a part of my consciousness of knowing I wanted to do more in that way of having compassion for all creatures. And so I don't know. I'm a tarot reader. I'm a Reiki practitioner. I mean, I don't know if you found that stuff online, but I love crystals and stones. And I'm sitting in front, like I have right now, like 20 some in front of me,
I love it.
so I'm always having these things around me, which I also consider to be kind of part of my spiritual path. I love all my stones and crystals. And I don't, they're not to me, I'm not a magical thinker, but I do believe in energy and everything is energy. And each of my rocks has a different kind of energy. I don't think like putting a rock on your chest is going to heal your grief, but it doesn't hurt you either.
Right.
And there's some nice feelings to these things, and I will use them, incorporate them with people. If you're in my office, they're everywhere. And sometimes I'll just say, you know what, pick up this big rose quartz and just hold that for a little while you're talking to me. And I use them when I work as an energy practitioner. I use them with people. So I mean, those are some kind of some fun facts about me. But and that's the thing for sure that has always been part of my life. I'm always picking up, even if they're not like, so here's a really beautiful smoky quartz, just a rock on the side of the road that I'm like, ooh, that's a pretty pink stone, I'll pick it up. There's rocks all over our house. And then my daughter, who's 15 now, she would bring home like all kinds of rocks with her. And so I'm always finding rocks and I'm like, we don't really need this rock in the house, but I have a hard time getting rid of them.
Can't
So,
hurt. I
and
mean,
sticks, I pick up sticks all the time. Sticks come in the house, but bringing nature inside the
I
house.
was gonna say you're so in tune with nature. I love it, and that is so calming. And one of the things I always say, like to fellow grievers and stuff, it's very easy to go inward and stay inside and not go for that 15-20 minute walk every day. But like that was so healing for me
Oh yeah.
personally in my journey, and getting the fresh air and taking those breaths and like getting away from the shallow, breaths that we
Oh,
so
absolutely.
easily get caught up in, and we can feel claustrophobic inside. So it's
Yeah.
good to integrate both into our life. And then the other thing, which you actually made a beautiful point, and that really, I almost should like reframe the question, is like, it's really not who you are outside of your loss. I mean, technically speaking, but really, I mean, grief is integrated into our lives. That's typically my message is like, okay, how can
Yeah.
all of these things coexist? So yeah, with that being said, I would love for you to, divulge however much you're comfortable with of your journey with grief, any major losses you've been through. You mentioned the animals. I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about anything about my loss. I mean, if you have looked me up, I mean, it's pretty public. So I'm a therapist. I've been a therapist for a long time. And that started, I mean, I noticed I was reading some things about you too, and I saw that you've always loved fashion. And so I actually worked retail for a long time. I have an English undergraduate degree. And actually, here's some fun facts. Like I didn't know what I wanted to do. Either I wanted to be a makeup artist, which in school I was a makeup counter girl, skincare, makeup, and loved all of that. But a serious makeup artist, like I loved doing that, even maybe working in theater, but or get a PhD in Shakespeare and teach Shakespeare. And so those, I never thought I'm going to be a therapist. And I got a part-time job to save money and move and do all the things that you need to do with deposits and all of that with a company that supported children and teenagers with autism and other developmental disabilities, but co-occurring with some serious mental health issues and behavioral problems. And I'd never done that kind of work. And it just happened to be a person who's really good at that. If you ever know anything about the field, it's like some people are just naturally good at that. I had no clue, had never done anything like it. And then from there, decided, well, how do I, if I want to stay in the field, how do I want to do that? What would it look like? And decided to get a master's and pursue a license in therapy. And thinking if I do the mental health track instead of like speech therapy or OT, which are amazing disciplines, I could potentially have more flexibility later on. And so that's what I did and became a therapist. And a lot of my work focused on working with autism and other developmental disabilities. And then I had a baby, and then that baby, my son, had a brain tumor and died of that brain tumor in 2006. And your life is just changed when something like that, everything changes when this happens. Mm-hmm. And I had always been really open to and interested in death and dying. And I took a semester long elective class in counseling and death and dying and grief and bereavement before any of that happened to me. And when it did happen to me, I was just so unprepared, right? It was just, you really cannot be prepared.
There's no class you
had time. Like I work with a lot of people who it's very sudden and shocking, and you don't have any time to. I had time to be with him and know what was happening. And I even thought, okay, it's gonna be, and I don't even think, but I did think easier adjustment. Mm-hmm. And I was really wrong. I was not prepared for what it would actually be like. Mm-hmm. And they didn't even talk about trauma in that class at all, which was interesting. It wasn't a bad class. It just was a lot of models about grief, which also interesting, but none of that. I mean, there's like study that you can do and research and reading and all of the literature that's out there and the preparation. It's no small thing, like getting your master's degree and everything you got to go through to do what I do and what other people like me do. Yeah. But having the experience yourself is completely different. Just, it blew me away. And I understand now when traumatic grief happens, and I know that both of your parents died, and I haven't, gone into the story enough, but I'm sure because it was unexpected. You watched both your parents go through this. Now both of them have gone. I know that there was trauma involved in that. And when you have trauma and grief, it's a different thing. You have grief on here on one side, and you have trauma, and trauma impacts people very differently. And then you have like that intersecting point where you have both of those things together. And when you have a major traumatic loss, and there's also multiple levels of trauma. Right. Anytime a child dies, from a parent's perspective, I might be 80 and my kid might be 60, and it would still be traumatic, no matter how that death would go. But usually there's other aspects too. It's like the suddenness, or there's violence, or there's prolonged pain, or watching your child go through a lot of pain. All of those are multiple levels and layers of trauma, and that impacts you. And it's like your universal worldview is totally shifted. And a lot of people might say, oh, they know that we never have tomorrow promised or whatever, but when it actually happens, then you realize like how much you walked around assuming that you were exempt somehow or somehow protected. And then all of a sudden you're not, right? And it's just like, oh my God, like everything that I thought was true is suddenly not. And what do you do with that? And it's this rebuilding process that takes a long time. It wasn't not my intent to be a grief therapist. Mm-hmm. It wasn't even on my radar. But what I did do was go to support group meetings, which were super helpful, incredibly helpful. A lot of people I think that in Richmond, where I live, in Richmond, Virginia, that I started the Miss Foundation chapter that's here, but it was already here. And I was really grateful to just have this space to walk into. And the Myth Foundation is an international organization that supports families after the death of a child. We're a nonprofit organization.
Mhm.
But the woman who was facilitating the groups at the time, when she found out I was a therapist, asked me to help because I had the skills, right? And this was like 2 years in, and I just thought, I don't really want to do that because if I do that, then I don't have a space.
Right,
But I
right.
also knew that I have the ability and I had gotten so much from that space that I wanted to help.
Mhm.
So I did that and then facilitated that group for 13 years after that. Thankfully now there's an awesome person who took it and is helping me because I do so many other things now. But then from that started doing some groups in local hospices, and those people were asking about whether I had a private therapy practice, which I didn't. I was still working in private schools with kids with autism and other disabilities. And then I thought when my daughter went to preschool, I had some time. And I thought, well, I'll open this thing on the side. And then within a year, I had enough people to quit my other job.
Wow.
But I did not start out just being full of grief clients because I was still really processing and dealing with my own grief. So it just sort of shifted over time. And now that's completely the opposite. Like I don't see anybody new unless it's a traumatically bereaved person. And, I'm in a different place because it's now 20 years later. So, but that process has been, a long, long journey. And I would have never thought, in 2006, 7, 8, that I would even have survived 20 years, you
Right.
know? So it's just been a really interesting journey for sure.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Okay, there's so much I wanted to dig into with you. I almost don't know where to start. But I'm so grateful that you brought up the trauma piece of it. We've touched on that here on the podcast a little bit here and there, but just having your expertise on that and just also mentioning like with so personally, like with my parents, they weren't s- horribly sudden deaths. Like I think when people think trauma, they think of some really immediate, impactful traumatic event, but
And
like
that is
absolutely,
one
absolutely.
kind.
What I think is sometimes overlooked and what I see a lot in this community is prolonged grief. And like so in my case, that was the anticipatory grief of both of my parents' deaths. Watching that
Yeah.
line
Well,
sitting
that watching somebody you love go through that is traumatic.
there.
And of course, like, trauma is subjective. It's your own experience. But
Yeah,
what trauma always
absolutely.
holds is fear and terror,
Yeah.
and it is an assault on your nervous system.
Yeah.
And it really is a subjective thing. Like there are
Mhm.
clinical measures that we look at to,
Mhm.
okay, are you experiencing these things and how is it, disrupting your life? But really you can't say was traumatic for one person or another person.
Yeah.
It's your experience, but really watching somebody you love go through that kind of pain.
Mhm.
And sometimes, like, even getting the news can
Yeah.
be traumatic. Like,
Yes.
not every moment was traumatic while my son was dying, but one of the most traumatic days was the very first day when we got that diagnosis, when he was sick and throwing up and having seizures and all these things that were happening. And then we get this news of a brain tumor. And that whole day was filled with lots of trauma. And then, there were surgeries and watching your child go through that and the chemo and all of the things. And then there were many moments of peace and beauty throughout, for me,
Yeah.
throughout his illness, even though I knew he was dying.
Mhm.
And his death itself, that moment was not traumatic,
Right.
but there were so many things within it. And then this like absence of him from our lives forever, in this physical life, that is traumatic. To think of that, like from the past version of me trying to envision a future, never
Mhm.
seeing him or knowing who he would be, or what he would like in life, or if he would have a partner or get married or have children or whatever, like all of these things that are like ripped from you. And you can understand some of that from your perspective of the rest of your life without your parents,
Yeah.
and all of your major life events of their absence.
Mhm.
all of those things. And then we revisit them over and over at different points in life.
Yeah.
When you get married, if you have children,
Yeah.
that all of that without your parents, it's just so much. And when you try to process it, it can just be so overwhelming. And, I think we're only really equipped to be able to process that kind of stuff in little bits. If
Mm.
we could experience, I think, the completeness of how really catastrophic it is, it would probably kill us in the moment.
Absolutely.
That's that numbness that you go through at a lot of the points in time. But like you're saying, even when there is a sudden event that happens and people kind of just go onto autopilot and you're numb, I think it is this protective mode of you couldn't even possibly face it all if you were really fully present for all of
Oh,
it.
absolutely. Yeah. It would like overwhelm
Hmm.
every piece of us, like mind, body, soul, physically, mentally, like
Yeah,
everything.
it's just a lot too much.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And one thing I definitely want to just reiterate that we kind of just touched on is like, and I've said this before, there's so much like stigma and other people that will, I see this all the time, like on social media and stuff, people expect me to be over it. Like not me personally, but like, these are the comments I get, right? Like,
for sure, yep.
people are like, it's been a year. Shouldn't you be okay? But like, there are countless milestones or even just the small day-to-day things that come up for us the rest of our lives
Yeah.
that are triggering, and it's like we have to grieve and re-grieve these things. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I got married roughly 2-3ish years after my parents died. That brought up a whole new level of things. As of this recording, I'm pregnant for the first time, so like, and I'm going through all of that. And then when she comes, like, oh my God, the birth and everything after that. And
Yeah.
so, and it's like, that's where it's just so disheartening sometimes when you see people being like, yo, shouldn't you move on? All those like, well, at least they had a good run. And all
Uh-huh.
those things that are so cringy to us
Yeah.
as grievers. And it's like, excuse me, can we get some, validation that like, this is, you hear it a lot, that grief is not linear. And that's just, I think one of the ways that can show up.
Yeah.
But really quick, and to kind of interrupt myself, I would love to hear kind of your take on this too, because, certainly I think a lot of people, can know or assume that trauma affects our mind and all of that, our emotions, but like, how can that also affect us physically? And I also
Um,
bring this up because I had a couple clients recently, we were talking about this, and they have been feeling some physical, I'm not going to say limitations, but they were like, I have no motivation and whatever. And we kind of got to a place of like, okay, a lot of this is stemming from your grief or unresolved things. And,
mhm.
so it was just whatever you can touch on there, like how trauma can also affect us from a,
Well, I mean, so you just mentioned something about motivation. I mean, that may or may not have anything to do with trauma. Like trauma impacts your nervous system,
Mhm.
and it is a nervous system based thing. So like when the event happens, we remember and process trauma even in the moment very differently than we process non-traumatic or just regular things, and it's stored in the brain in a different way as well. And so, when something happens that and I don't use that word trigger anymore. It's just like, and not that you can't, but it's everywhere, and especially with the proliferation of gun violence all over the place. You never know what somebody's trauma has been, but it really is a cue. Like when you have these things that show up in your environment or even within you in your subconscious or somewhere in a body memory, because your cells all have a memory. And like I'm sure you've heard, and a lot of your listeners I'm sure have heard of that, the book The Body Keeps the Score, right? So we experience trauma on a cellular level, and we experience traumatic grief on a cellular level, and even maybe non-traumatic grief in our bodies.
Mhm.
In fact, like all emotions happen in your body, feelings happen in your body, thoughts happen in your mind, and your mind is really a non-local place. Like we don't know where our mind is. A lot of people think, oh, it's right here in your where your brain is, but that's not where your mind is. Nobody really knows where your mind is. It's everywhere and nowhere. And when you think something, that's a cognitive process, but the feelings are always in the body. There's, muscle tension, stomach flutters,
That's kind of
hormones
what I was
and
getting
chemicals
at.
are released.
Yeah.
So when you have trauma and you have those post-traumatic stress moments, it's when your body is being cued to sort of re-experience that in some way, where you're remembering that fear and that trauma. And then the moment that we won't get like super into brain science, but there's the
I love
structure in the
that.
middle of your brain, the amygdala, which is like the first alarm place. It's like the first place in your brain that notices the fear, and it sends a message. It's called the HPA axis, right? And it's when the brain then is like sending all these messages. The pituitary gland sends messages to the adrenals, and then it all follows this pattern. And then they release all these chemicals and the hormones that send you into the fight or flight mode, which is your sympathetic nervous system. And that process takes 0.006 seconds. Like it is so fast, like you cannot predict it. And that's why a lot of times it's subconscious as well. I mean, even smells, and we all know that smells are when you smell something, that your olfactory bulb is right, it's like your brain tissue on the outside of your body. And it's connected directly to your limbic system, which is where that amygdala lives in the limbic system, which is a lot of people will call it the lizard brain, right? The reptilian brain that's all about nothing but survival. And it overrides everything in the frontal cortex, which is where we have our higher thoughts and planning ability and executive functioning, all these things where we can think and ask questions and answer questions. That part of our brain reacts immediately. It's all about survival. And as soon as you smell something, those scent molecules hit the olfactory bulb. And if there are memories associated with the smell, you will experience that immediately.
Right.
Sometimes even before you have the chance to go, what is that smell? And then put it together with where you remember that smell from. And if there's like a traumatic event that's connected to a smell, or even we'll just say like an upsetting one,
Yeah.
you can re-experience those feelings in your body. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I've had that.
So, right? You know that as soon as you smell something. And in terms of like grief and death, you have difficult things and really wonderful things. Like a lot of people really want to hold on to the smell of the people that they love, and revisit that smell. And even to the point, some people, if there's a certain cologne, you can go buy it and then you will have that smell with you.
Guilty.
Right? And then there's other aspects of it, like maybe smelling funeral flowers is not good, or like the smell of like turned earth will bring back the memory of standing at a graveside before you can even put it together, like what's going on. And sometimes it can just hit you so fast that you're suddenly in like what we call a panic attack. And I'll tell you, everybody has anxiety. That's a human thing. I never had a panic attack until after my son died. And I knew it was connected, but at the time, like I wasn't sure exactly what it was, but I've heard so many more people. Sometimes like it happens more rarely now, but I don't even try to figure out what it is about now. It could even be how you're holding your body, a certain physical posture that you're using that activates that memories that are in your cells, like being in a place that's familiar or where you're connected to a trauma. Like I just shared this with somebody earlier. I had a thing happen to me. I had a colonoscopy this summer. That was really super fun. But I mean, actually the colonoscopy itself was fine, but it's the
It's the
prep.
prep.
Everybody talks about it.
I have to do one
So
next year. I'm like, oh no.
that happened, and I was in this place where that's all they do. So there were a lot of people, and they put you in a curtained space, and you're there, and they're going to wheel you into the room where they do all the stuff. But the nurse came in and she was going to insert the IV, and I was fine, like everything's fine, and I was dehydrated, so it wasn't going in, and she couldn't find a vein, which is not good when that happens. But instantly, and I was not expecting this, I was transported to the day that my son was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and he had been vomiting, and they were trying to get an IV in him, and they couldn't. And they were trying, and he was crying and crying and crying, and I just suddenly was like back there and I was so surprised by it. And immediately I just started crying and I was like sobbing. And she's like, "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll get the nurse anesthetist to do it. I won't bother." And I was like, "It's fine.
She
It's
thought
not
it
really
was
that."
right.
I wanted to just like cry. And I mean, I knew what was happening, but I was so shocked because I was not
Did
expecting it.
not see that coming.
Like there was nothing in that room or that procedure or anything else. And I've had blood drawn since then.
Mm-hmm.
It was really strange. Like I still don't know exactly what it was that brought it back like that. And I didn't even try to figure it out, but I had to calm down because I could not. One, if I'd had a big breakdown, they would probably have sent me home and I'd have to go through this
Like,
again.
I gotta
I
get
don't
this
want to
thing.
do that. But then there's other people and they would be like, "What's wrong with that woman? Oh, how awful."
They're like
So
freaking everyone else
I've
out.
got to calm down. I have to calm down. And it's not the first time that's happened, but it's the first time in a long time that it had happened. And I was so surprised, and I thought later, and this is where, I mean, somebody who doesn't know what's going on, or they don't have the experience, or they don't have the skills to manage it, it's not like you want to go back there. But I was like, I really wish I had had the time and the space to just have that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But having the ability to calm my body down
Mm-hmm.
is huge. And that is something that when you have trauma, whether it's grief related or not, is you need to find somebody to help you learn how you do that. Because when you have complex trauma too, which is when you have trauma that's not just one discrete event, but many things and potentially like repeated traumatic events over time, you don't know when something's going to pop up like that. There is no way we can ever say, "Oh, I'm completely free of my trauma now." We just can't.
Yeah.
When you have long term and multiple complex traumatic events that have happened to you. And having the skills and the ability to understand what's going on, one is very empowering, but literally gives you the ability to calm your nervous system down. Because when you can do that, you can stop that from happening. Like I can, in myself, stop a panic attack in like 30 seconds just by breathing. And I can teach people how to do this.
Yeah.
And that comes, I didn't mention before, but you had said in an email wanting to talk about the yoga aspect,
I was gonna ask, try
right?
and get into that next. Yeah, and I would love to hear this perfect segue actually. So if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that, how you
Yeah,
got into
sure.
it, but then the breathing aspect for sure. This is something I am like, it has revolutionized my grief and the way that I handle it and cope with these things. So
Absolutely.
yes, please
I mean, it is,
elaborate.
you hear this a lot. I mean, when I've worked with people a long time, and even like I remember when I worked with teenagers exclusively for a really long time, and
That
they
was
would always just
probably
like,
interesting.
"Oh yeah, you're telling me to, okay, I need to breathe, breathe."
Breathe, okay,
No,
fun.
seriously, it works. Like it is your best friend.
Yeah, it's so
Not
simple.
only
It's so underrated.
it's totally,
Like,
and that's crazy because if
I
we weren't
know.
listening, it would be really bad.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
didn't have your breath.
right.
But it is the one autonomic function that we actually can control. I mean, there are people who say they can, and it's not untrue. I mean, especially with biofeedback, and there are some yogic practices and mindfulness practices that can help, but there are people who can lower their blood pressure like on command and slow their
Mhm.
heart rate down. But your breath is the easiest thing you can work with, and it is the direct line to your nervous system that can calm you down.
Beautifully said.
When we are breathing slowly and deeply in our bellies, like at your diaphragm, not
Make
in
me
your
want to do this
chest,
now.
right? Look, I see you.
Yeah,
Look at you getting ready.
yeah.
When we breathe into our belly, as opposed to up here in our chest, the signal that gets sent to your brain is that you are safe and everything is okay.
Yeah.
Now, you might be telling yourself something totally different in your mind, but if you are sending the message through your body will calm down. The
Yeah.
mind is much more difficult to work with in a lot of ways. Once you learn, most ways, really, once you learn how to calm your body down, you can practice that. And really, you should. Like, it's not a thing you want to wait until you need it because it's
Right.
very difficult to manage. And the reason that, did my first yoga teacher training in 2002, which was before my son was even born. It was like right at the end of grad school. I was doing both those things at once. So I was finishing grad school and just starting my yoga teacher training.
Mhm.
So I had practiced it already lots and lots of times. Because in yoga, I mean, one of the limbs of yoga is pranayama, which actually translates to mean prana means life force. It's the universal life force. And yama means to control or restrain. And really, it is the control of your life force when you practice pranayama. But the primary way that we receive prana into our being is through the breath. We receive that universal life force through sunshine. This is why you feel good outside through being in fresh air, but mostly we breathe it in. Actually, when you're around bodies of water, there's extra prana.
Yes.
Ocean is the most prana you can have. This is why everybody, when they go to the beach, the first thing they do is they're like filling up with all this prana in the air. It's in the food that you eat. Like the fresher your food is, the more prana is in it. Like if you have broccoli and it's fresh and you just pluck it off, it's filled with the life force of that plant. Wow. And leave it in your fridge for a week and you can see it gets all limp and it doesn't have any life force in it. Its prana is gone. But the main way that we receive our life force is through the breath. And so when you do these yogic breath exercises, you're learning how to increase. So you can control it, you can lengthen it. You use prana in many different ways. The breath exercises are deepening it, holding it. There's all kinds of ways you can do it, but the best one that you can learn, especially when you're dealing with trauma and grief, is the most basic. It's called in yoga, it's called Dirga Swasam, and it's the 3-part breath. And even with trying to teach people how to do it in 3 parts, which can be complicated, the basic thing is slow your breath down. You want to breathe in slowly and fill up all the space inside your lungs. Doesn't really matter what part you do it, 1, 2, or 3, but you fill it all up until you have no more space inside your lungs and you can't get any more air in there. And then you slowly let it out. And the more you practice that, then you want to start working towards having your exhalation be a little bit longer than your inhalation. And then you can work towards, inhaling and pausing and holding it just for a couple beats and then exhaling for longer and then pausing. And I think, one of a really popular one that you can find is that the box breathing. Have you heard of this?
Yep.
Right. Of you breathe in for 4, hold it for 4, breathe out for 4, let it be for 4, breathe in for 4. But I mean, you don't even have to worry about counting and doing 4 and holding it. Just breathe in slow until you can't get any more air in there. And then let it out really slow. It's really basic.
Yeah.
But you have to practice, because when you're in the moment of having a trauma response, post-traumatic stress response, then your brain goes offline. You don't have, it's when the limbic system we talked about earlier is freaking out and all this is happening. You don't have the wherewithal to access this part that goes, oh, look, I'm having a trauma response. Let me use my skills. You can't if you don't have the skill already.
Yes, good point.
And the more you practice it, the more it can become second nature.
Yeah.
And that's so when I went through what I went through, and I will say all my yoga training really helped me at his diagnosis and through the illness. And when he died, I was like, fuck yoga. It doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It was just none of that matters to me either. It didn't help me. But, later I realized actually it was helping me. It was already there. In the beginning, though, I didn't have anybody. I was kind of doing it on my own too. And I had nobody to tell me, it's okay if you roll this mat out and you get furious and you can't do one pose. Because also, yoga is not about the poses. That's only one small aspect of it. And so later on, I realized how really I had been accessing all those skills from all the different branches of yoga, which are many. The aspect of yoga in the postures is only part of one, well, really 2 branches of yoga. The other ones are philosophical, really.
Yes.
And spiritual.
Yep.
And full of all these different skills and tools. And usually, most people who practice yoga access various pieces of those many different branches. but it's never just the postures.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize until later really how many pieces of those things had been helping me the whole time, which is where the Yoga for Grief and Loss book came from.
Mhm.
And that came from a workshop that I did when I was trying to figure out like I wanted to go to this conference, which was the Miss Foundation conference, which we no longer do the big conferences, but I wanted to go. And at the time we only had them like every 2 years. And when he died, it was too soon. I just couldn't do it. And then the next conference I was pregnant and I couldn't go. The next conference I had a baby and I couldn't go. And the next time I was like, I need to get there. And
Yeah.
so I submitted a proposal. I was like, if I submit a proposal for a workshop and they accept it, then I have to go because I will do things for work before I will do things for like
Fair.
myself, which is not the greatest, self-care ability, but I'm better than I used to be. But they accepted it now because I said I'll do this Yoga for Grief and Loss workshop. And then once they accepted it, I had to figure out what I was going to do. So I wrote it up and I had this like 20-page PDF handout as part of it. And then later that thing grew into the book. But writing that book was really a challenge because it was this whole like thing. I mean, I'm no guru. I had only been practicing yoga for a really short period of time. And I thought, well, I don't have the right to be doing this. And then I thought, well, yes, I do. Who else has the right to be doing this?
Yeah.
And it was this really deep, and even just I've heard this saying, if you want to learn something, write a book about it.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Like it was this huge learning journey. And it took me a lot longer than I thought, but it was really an incredible thing to do that, to write that book and be practicing as I'm doing it and seeing not only from my experience, but then living it in that moment and really deepening my practice as I went. And then seeing how it's just part of my life now.
Yeah.
It's like my day-to-day walk, even if I'm not doing asanas every day, so there's so many aspects of it that have been so helpful. But the one thing that can really help people is learning how to breathe. And you don't even have to go to yoga for that. I mean, you can learn that on your own, of just learning how to watch your body. And your breath is your friend. Like it can tell you if you're attuned to it, you can know. That can be your first clue that you're getting nervous or you're getting worried, or when your breath is shallow and it's in
Oh
your
yeah.
chest, you can, oh, okay, something's going on. It's a clue, right?
Yep.
You can learn how to calm down so that you can function. And it doesn't mean that if there's a problem, the problem goes away, but it means that you can manage yourself through it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a huge skill because
Yeah.
it's guaranteed to work. It's just biologically impossible when you are breathing that way and your brain is picking up, oh, we must be fine because we're breathing in our belly and it's okay. It's physiologically impossible to be having the stress response. So it must, I mean, it not like must like it has to work. It just does. Like there's no
Yeah.
question, right? Same
Yeah.
thing with meditation, which is another thing
Mm.
that can really help us over time.
Yep.
It's a brain-based thing. And the more you do it, it's just like going to the gym and lifting weights. Your muscle's gonna grow. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you like it or if it's boring.
Right.
And when you meditate, and after you get past that, it's really not boring. It's
Yeah.
very
No, I
people, you kind of
love
feel like, I
meditation.
gotta have this space, but it helps our brain. And what happens in your brain, this is like the shortest version, is all of the areas of your brain that respond to fear and withdrawal and avoidance start to literally get smaller.
Mm.
And the parts of your brain that respond to engagement and approach behaviors, which are about, bravery and courage and connection with other people, get bigger. Like, so your brain is not a muscle, but like a muscle, the more you use specific parts of your brain, literally the stronger and denser they become. You get more gray matter, it forms more neural connections, and then you have more resources to deal with from a brain perspective and a nervous system perspective when there's a problem that comes up. And there's so much research on this that it is like really crazy now. Like there's
Oh
so
yeah.
much research on it that shows that that is what happens.
Yeah.
And in grief, it helps you to be able to find those places inside of you that also can help connect you with the people that you love who have died. Because And even you might not think of meditation as a spiritual experience, but it is. And if you read about people's, lived experiences through meditation, what happens is when you're in that space, you feel this connected place.
Mm-hmm.
It also happens in your brain. It just does. We have parts of our brain that light up and get active when we are having a spiritual experience, whatever you call that. And a lot of times what I'll say is just what creates awe and wonder for you. That's a spiritual experience. And you can be an atheist and have atheists are spiritual people.
Yeah.
But your brain has that experience too of like expansion, and not literally, well, literally some of the parts expand because they get bigger and strong, but that sense of expansion and space, and sort of when you're in grief and when you've had trauma, you often have this sense of being very constricted, right? And we
Yes.
go through these periods where we're definitely contracted and we're in these places.
Yep.
And then doing practices and having ways that we can then have this sense of expansion and openness helps to balance that out. And it's a way to have the spiritual connection, even when you might feel that whatever your spiritual practice was before is inaccessible now.
Mm-hmm.
Without it having to be religion based, because it doesn't have to be about religion, although every religion has this a contemplative and meditative practices within it. So there must be a reason that that's the case.
Wow, what a part one of this episode. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I really hope that part of this conversation, or maybe Karla's story, resonated with you in some way. I just love chatting with Karla too. She has such a beautiful and kind of calming energy, and it's very clear to me why she does the work that she does and why she does it so amazingly. But also, we really haven't addressed trauma in such a specific way on this podcast before. So, if there is some trauma around your loss or losses, or it is just a part of your grief journey, I really hope today helped you. I have no doubt part 2 is going to be a game changer for you as well. So, be sure to look out for that. Biggest takeaway for me for this episode is the breath work. I'm always preaching this, but I love how she explained it. I think it was really different and unique and important to hear. So I really hope that resonated with you and is maybe something you can try if you haven't yet. Anyway, I am so glad we were able to spend some time together today, my friend. I am sending you all the love in the world, and I will catch you in the next episode. I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you're taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, more coping tools, ways to work with me, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Losses Become Gains Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. And remember to always keep asking yourself, how will I turn my losses into gains today? I'll catch you in the next episode.